The morning my uncle slid that document across the conference table, he was smiling. Not the polite, mournful smile people wear at estate meetings, the real one. The one that meant I've already won. He had a copy of my grandfather's will in a burgundy folder, tabbed and highlighted. His attorney sat beside him. His wife had worn her good pearls. My cousin Marcus had driven 4 hours from Columbus for this. And I sat across from all of them with a cup of gas station coffee and a manila envelope I hadn't opened yet. The document my uncle pushed toward me was a deed. The family cabin. 42 acres on Barrow Lake in northern Michigan. The place where my grandfather had taught me to read a compass, where I'd learned the names of every tree in those woods, where he and I had eaten cereal out of the box on the porch every single morning of every single summer for 22 years. "I think you'll find," my uncle said, capping his pen with a small, definitive click, "that your grandfather was very clear about his wishes." I looked at the deed. Then I looked at my manila envelope. Then I smiled back at him, not the polite, mournful kind, and I said, "I think you're right, he was." My name is Cecilia Voss Hartley. My grandfather built that cabin with his own hands in 1971. And what happened in that conference room on a Tuesday in October is a story about a man who loved me so quietly, so carefully, so completely that he spent the last decade of his life making sure no one could ever take what he meant to leave me. This is that story. My grandfather's name was Edmund Hartley, but everyone called him Ed. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't say "I love you" easily, not because he didn't feel it, but because his generation expressed love through action, through presence, through the slow accumulation of reliable, steady choices made on your behalf over years and years and years. If Ed Hartley loved you, he showed up. He fixed things. He planned ahead. He made sure you would be okay. He was born in 1941 in a small town outside of Traverse City, Michigan, the third of 5 children, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher. He learned early that things built well outlasted things built fast. His father's workshop was in the basement, and Ed spent his childhood there, learning the difference between green wood and seasoned wood, between a nail and a screw, between a joint that would hold and one that would fail under pressure. He married my grandmother, Ruth, in 1965. She was a librarian. She read 3 books a week for 60 years. She kept index cards. They had 2 children. My mother, Patricia, called Pat, and my uncle, Gerald. I am Pat's daughter. I am the only grandchild who isn't Gerald's. That matters. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. My mother and Gerald were not close, even as children. My grandmother used to say, diplomatically, that they were very different people. What she meant was that Pat Reed and Gerald schemed. Pat volunteered at the library on weekends. Gerald figured out, by age 14, that if he cried convincingly enough after breaking something, he didn't have to pay for it. Gerald grew up and became a land developer. He built subdivisions with names like Whispering Oaks and Meadow Glen, neighborhoods that had neither oaks nor meadows, on land that had been neither of those things for decades. He made decent money at it. Not great money. Gerald had a talent for spending just ahead of what he earned, but decent. He married a woman named Constance in 1989. Constance came from a family with money, which was, I suspect, at least part of what Gerald found attractive about her. She was not warm. She was careful. She kept track of things, gifts, slights, perceived inequities, with a precision that would have impressed a forensic accountant. They had 2 sons, Marcus and Tyler. My mother married my father, David Voss, in 1990. My father was an electrician. He was kind and funny and not particularly ambitious in the financial sense, but he was steady, reliable in the same way my grandfather was reliable. He showed up. He fixed things. I was born in 1991. My parents divorced when I was 7. My father moved to Portland. My mother and I stayed in Traverse City, 20 minutes from my grandparents. This is the part that changed everything, though I didn't understand it at the time. When my parents' marriage ended, my grandfather stepped in. Not intrusively, not with opinions about fault or blame. He simply appeared consistently for the next 25 years. Every Wednesday night, dinner at their house. Every summer, 2 weeks at the cabin. Every significant moment, school play, science fair, driver's test, college orientation, he was there, quiet and certain in the second row. When I was 9, he taught me to play chess. We played every Wednesday for 6 years. He never let me win. When I was 15, he brought a compass to the cabin and told me to find my way back from a point 3 miles into the woods without him. I was terrified. I did it in 2 hours. When I walked out of the tree line and found him sitting on the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade, he just said, "I knew you would." When I was 21 and telling him I wanted to study environmental law, he said, "That's a hard field. You'll be good at it." He never oversold. He never flattered. When Ed Hartley said you could do something, you believed him because he didn't say things he didn't mean. The cabin was built in 1971, the year after my mother was born. Grandfather drove up to Barrow Lake with a surveying friend, bought 42 acres for less than $10,000 from a man who was moving to Arizona, and spent the next 3 summers building a structure that was, by any honest assessment, overbuilt. The walls were 2 inches thicker than code required. The roof was standing seam steel when everyone else was using composite shingles. The foundation was poured concrete, 4 feet deep. The windows were triple glazed before triple glazing was a marketing term. "If you build it right," he told me once, standing on the porch looking at the lake, * you only have to build it once. My mother loved the cabin the way you love a place that formed you. She loved the smell of it, pine and lake water and wood smoke, and she loved the silence of it, the way the world simplified up there to weather and water and the business of the trees. She took me every summer. Even after the divorce, even after money got tight, even after the drive became harder as her knees got worse, she took me. Gerald's family came up some summers too. Constance found the cabin rustic in a way she tolerated rather than enjoyed. Marcus and Tyler were older than me, Marcus by 6 years, Tyler by 4, and they spent most of their cabin time complaining about the Wi-Fi, which was, in the early years, non-existent. My grandfather noticed who loved the place and who endured it. He was paying attention. He was always paying attention. My grandmother Ruth died in March of 2017, a Tuesday, from a stroke that was swift and without prolonged suffering, which is the kind of mercy you can feel grateful for even while you're devastated. She was 78. She had finished a novel the week before. She had her index cards. My grandfather sat at her kitchen table for a long time after the funeral. He wasn't incapacitated by grief. He was too structured for that, but he was quieter than usual, which for Ed Hartley meant nearly silent. He began going through papers. He reorganized the garage. He started taking longer walks. About 6 months after my grandmother died, I drove up to see him on a Wednesday in September. It was warm still, the trees just beginning to turn at the edges. He made coffee. We sat on the back porch. He said, "I've been talking to Harold." Harold Beckett was his attorney. He had been my grandfather's attorney for over 30 years. He did wills and property law and small business matters out of an office on Front Street with wood paneling and a fish on the wall. I said, "Oh." He said, "I want to make sure things are handled properly, after I'm gone." I said, "Grandpa, you don't have to." He said, "I'm 82, Cecilia. Everyone is going to die. I'm going to die. I want to know that I've done things right." He was not asking for reassurance. He was telling me something. He was orienting me, the way he'd oriented me in those woods with the compass, giving me a bearing. I listened. He said, "The cabin is the thing I care most about. I want it to go to someone who'll take care of it, who understands what it is." He looked at me for a moment, and then looked at the trees. He said, "Gerald has talked to me about it. He thinks it should be sold, divided, if we can agree on value. Real estate around Barrow Lake has gone up. He's done some research." I didn't say anything. He said, "I know what the cabin is worth in dollars. That's not what I'm talking about." I didn't know, then, the full shape of what he was planning. I knew he was talking to Harold. I knew he cared about the cabin. I knew that Gerald had been making noise about the property for a year or more. I'd heard the edges of it from my mother, who was not a person who liked conflict and therefore kept information close when she could. What I didn't know was that Gerald had hired his own attorney. And I didn't know that his attorney had begun sending letters to Harold Beckett, suggesting that my grandfather's estate planning was, in a phrase that would come back in the conference room 3 years later, not reflective of Ede's true and current wishes. The letters suggested, delicately at first and then less delicately, that at 82, recently widowed, a man could be influenced. That certain family members, not Gerald, of course, never Gerald, might be positioned closer to the decision-making than was appropriate. That Harold Beckett might want to consider having his client independently evaluated. My grandfather found out about the letters in November. I know this because he told me, one Wednesday in December, sitting at the kitchen table with chess pieces between us, in the same even tone he used for everything. He said, "Gerald thinks I'm not competent to manage my own affairs." I looked up from the board. He said, he's having his attorney suggest it to Harold, in writing, so there's a record. I said, "Grandpa." He said, "Don't be upset. It tells me what I need to know. He moved his bishop. Check." I looked at the board. I wasn't thinking about chess. I said, "What does it tell you?" He said that I need to be more careful than I already was. He won that game in 4 more moves. He always won. What happened over the next 2 years, I only know in pieces from Harold Beckett, from my mother, and from a series of letters my grandfather wrote me, longhand, on the cream-colored stationery he had used for 40 years, which arrived in my mailbox every few months without announcement. He completed a formal cognitive evaluation in January of 2018. He requested it himself, through his own physician, without telling Gerald he was doing it. The evaluation was thorough neuropsychological testing, an interview, a written report. He scored in the 91st percentile for his age group in executive function. His physician noted that he presented as, and I am paraphrasing the report that Harold showed me later, unusually deliberate and strategically clear-minded for a man of any age, let alone 82. He completed an updated will in February of 2018. Harold Beckett drafted it. 2 witnesses who were not family members signed it. It was notarized. He updated it again in September of 2019. And in December of 2019, he did something I didn't fully understand until the morning in the conference room, when my uncle slid a deed across a mahogany table and smiled at me like he'd already won. My grandfather created a separate legal instrument, not a codicil, not an amendment, but a standalone document filed with the County Register of Deeds and cross-referenced to his will by a provision Harold called, in the precise language of estate law, a * condition precedent clause. In plain terms, a clause with a condition that had to be met before any inheritance could transfer. Gerald had a copy of the will. He did not have the clause. My grandfather had a stroke in February of 2020. It was not severe, not like the one that had taken my grandmother. It affected his left hand, his balance, and his stamina. He recovered most of the function in his hand over 6 weeks of physical therapy. His balance improved with a cane. His stamina did not fully return. He was 88 years old. He was still sharper than most people half his age. But the stroke changed the architecture of his daily life, and Gerald noticed. Within 3 weeks of my grandfather's discharge from the hospital, Gerald and Constance were spending more time in Traverse City. They offered to help manage his finances. They offered to drive him to appointments. They offered, with great solicitousness, to help him think through his affairs before anything happened that might leave things complicated. My mother, who was 70 years old herself and managing her own health, called me after the first of these visits and said, "Cease, something feels wrong." I drove up the following weekend. Gerald was there when I arrived. He was sitting in the living room with a legal pad, and he had, arranged on the coffee table, a series of documents: property tax assessments, recent sales of comparable lake properties, a printed estimate from a real estate agent. That together formed a clear argument for selling the cabin now, while the market was strong. My grandfather was in his chair by the window, watching Gerald talk with an expression I recognized. It was not a confused expression. It was the chess expression, the one he used when he was letting you think you were winning. He let Gerald talk for another 15 minutes. Then he said, "Gerald, I appreciate you looking into this. I'll think about it." Gerald said, "Dad, I just want to make sure." My grandfather said, "I know what you want to make sure of." He said it calmly, without anger. "I appreciate it." I said, "I'll think about it." Gerald left 2 hours later. When his car was gone from the driveway, my grandfather and I sat in the kitchen and he poured us both coffee, and we didn't talk about Gerald for a while. We talked about the winter. We talked about a book he was reading. Then he said, "Call Harold for me this week. Tell him I want to review the December document." I said, "The December document?" He said, "He'll know what I mean." I called Harold Beckett that Monday. Harold was 74 himself, careful and precise, a man who had dedicated his professional life to making sure that what people wanted to happen after they died actually happened. He had a voice like weathered oak, steady, slow, and solid. He said, "Your grandfather is very thorough, Cecilia. I want you to know that." I said, "Is everything in order?" He said, "Yes, but there are things I want to walk you through in person at the right time. Your grandfather would like you to be prepared." I said, "For what?" He said, "For whatever Gerald does after." He paused. He said, "Ede has been planning this for 3 years. He's thought of things most people never think of. When the time comes, and I hope it's still a long time from now, you will not be unprepared." I drove home from that phone call with a feeling I couldn't entirely name. It wasn't fear. It was something more like gravity, like the ground had become more real beneath my feet. My grandfather lived another 2 years. They were good years in the ways that matter. He read. He played chess with me and with a man from his neighborhood named Carl who came every Thursday. He went to the cabin every August, which required more planning than it had before: a ramp, a specific chair, different sleeping arrangements. But he went. He sat on the porch every morning with cereal and Lakeview, and the summer I came for both weeks instead of one. He told me the second morning that he was glad. Gerald came to the cabin once that August for a weekend. He walked the property. He took photographs of the tree line and the dock and the outbuildings. He asked my grandfather in the kitchen on Saturday evening whether he had updated his will recently. My grandfather said, "I keep everything current. You don't need to worry." Gerald said, "I just want to make sure everyone is treated fairly." My grandfather looked at him for a moment and then said, "Gerald, I have always treated you fairly." A pause. "Go help Constance with the dishes." In September of 2021, I received a letter. Cream stationery. My grandfather's handwriting, which had changed with his left hand but was still unmistakably his, careful, slightly slanted, every word formed with intention. The letter said, "Dear Cecilia **, I am writing to tell you that I have been very proud of you, not for any one thing, for the accumulation of things, for the way you have grown into a person who can be trusted. That is not a small thing. Most people want to be loved. The rarer gift is to be trusted. I have left things for Harold to explain to you. I have tried to be thorough. I have tried to be fair. I want you to know that fair does not always mean equal, it means right. Sometimes the right thing and the equal thing are the same. Sometimes they are not. The cabin is where I have been most myself. I want it to be where you are most yourself. With love always. Grandpa **. He died 11 weeks later, at home, in his sleep, in November of 2021. He was 89 years old. Harold Beckett called me the morning after the funeral, not to discuss the estate that would come. He called to say that he was sorry and that Ede had spoken of me often, and that when I was ready, there were things to go over. I said, "I know. He told me there would be." Harold said, "He said you'd say that." I took a week. I went to the cabin by myself in late November, which I had never done before. The roads were clear, but the lake had a skim of ice at the edges. I brought cereal. I sat on the porch in a down coat in 32-degree air and looked at the water and talked to my grandfather in my head the way you do with people you lose. Then I drove to Harold's office. The office was warm and smelled like old paper, and the fish on the wall had not changed in the 20-plus years I had been aware of it. Harold sat behind his desk, and I sat across from him, and he had a neat stack of folders and a yellow legal pad, and he looked the way people look when they are about to tell you something important that they have been holding carefully for a long time. He said, "I want to start by telling you what the will says. Then I want to tell you about the December 2019 document. They work together, but you need to understand each one first." The will was, in its basic structure, what I expected. The house in Traverse City would go to my mother and Gerald equally. They could sell or buy the other out. Personal property would be divided as specified in a memorandum. Financial accounts divided between his 2 children. The cabin and the 42 acres of land at Barrow Lake to be distributed per the terms of a separate recorded instrument. That last line, per the terms of a separate recorded instrument. Gerald's attorney had gotten a copy of the will. Gerald knew about that line. He had spent 2 years trying to find out what asterisk separate recorded instrument meant. Harold told me this directly. Gerald had made inquiries. He had contacted the Register of Deeds office. He had hired a title search company. He had found the deed. The deed was a real document, a transfer of the cabin property into a specific type of trust, an irrevocable trust created in December of 2019. The trustee was Harold Beckett. The named beneficiary was, on the face of the deed, simply, the qualified heir as defined in Exhibit A of the accompanying Hartley Family Cabin Trust Agreement, dated December 14, 2019. Gerald had found the deed. He had not found Exhibit A. Exhibit A was not recorded publicly. It was held by Harold in a sealed envelope as part of the trust agreement. Under the terms the instrument created, it could only be opened at the first estate meeting attended by all potential heirs or their legal representatives, which was the meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday in October. Harold walked me through Exhibit A on that Thursday afternoon. He opened the envelope carefully, the way you open things that matter. Inside was a 3-page document in my grandfather's handwriting, signed, witnessed, and notarized on December 14, 2019, 2 weeks after he'd found out about Gerald's attorney's letters. The document defined the qualified heir. Not by name. By condition. My grandfather had written, in his careful, slightly slanted hand, a set of criteria. He called them the cabin conditions that the inheriting party had to meet. They were specific. They were measurable. They were things that could be verified by documentation. I will tell you what they were. The first condition. The qualified heir must have been present at the cabin for a minimum of 5 consecutive summers during the period 1995-2020, with presence verified by at least 2 corroborating witnesses or documentary evidence. The second condition. The qualified heir must have demonstrated, at any point during the period 2010-2021, knowledge of the cabin's maintenance systems, specifically the well pump, the septic system, and the steel roof inspection protocol, sufficient to manage the property independently. This was to be verified by a written statement from Harold Beckett or a designated property manager who had observed or been informed of this knowledge by Ede Hartley himself. The third condition. The qualified heir must hold, at the time of inheritance, a stable legal residence in Michigan or demonstrate intent to maintain the property as a primary seasonal residence rather than convert it to rental or commercial use. A signed statement to this effect, subject to a 5-year deed restriction, was required. And the fourth condition, the one that made me put the paper down for a moment and look at the fish on the wall, the fourth condition. The qualified heir must have received, at some point in Ede Hartley's lifetime, a letter from Ede Hartley written on cream-colored stationery, referencing the cabin specifically, and kept that letter in their possession at the time of the estate meeting. This letter is not to be shared, copied, or produced in advance, only presented in original form at the meeting itself. The purpose of this condition is not bureaucratic. It is to ensure that whoever inherits this place loved it the way it deserves to be loved, quietly, privately, without performance. I had the letter, the September letter, the one about being trusted. I had kept it in my desk drawer since the day it arrived. I had not told anyone about it. Harold said, "Your grandfather told me, when we drafted this, that the person who met all 4 conditions would be obvious. He said if he was wrong about who that person was, then the document would tell him so, and he would rather be proven wrong in writing than be right in his head and leave things unprotected." He said he also told me that Gerald would hire an attorney for the estate meeting, and that Gerald's attorney would have a copy of the deed and try to argue that the beneficiary designation was too vague to be enforceable. He said we anticipated that argument. The trust was structured specifically to withstand it. It was reviewed by an estate litigation specialist in Grand Rapids before it was executed. The structure is sound. He slid a copy of Exhibit A across to me. He said, "I'll need you to bring the letter on Tuesday. Keep it sealed in the envelope until I ask for it." I drove home in the dark, 2 hours south from Traverse City, and I thought about my grandfather sitting at his kitchen table in December of 2019, 2 weeks after learning his son thought he was mentally incompetent, writing 4 conditions by hand on cream-colored paper. Thinking it through, being thorough, being careful. Building it right, so he only had to build it once. The conference room was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, neutral territory, Harold's suggestion, which Gerald had agreed to with the kind of easy confidence that meant he thought the location didn't matter, because he already knew how the meeting would go. I arrived 8 minutes early. Harold was already there, his folders arranged, his legal pad open, his reading glasses on the table beside a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked at me when I walked in and gave one small nod, the kind that means we're ready. I sat across from his chair, with my gas station coffee and my manila envelope on the table in front of me. The envelope contained 3 things: a copy of the 4 conditions Harold had given me, a folder of documentation I had spent the weekend assembling, and the letter. Still in its original cream envelope, my grandfather's handwriting on the front. Cecilia. Gerald arrived 11 minutes late. This was, I later understood, intentional, a small dominance move, the kind Constance had probably suggested. He came in with his attorney, a man named Darren Polk who wore a suit that cost more than my monthly rent and carried a leather portfolio that made a soft, expensive sound when he set it on the table. Marcus came in behind them. Tyler had apparently decided not to attend, which told me something. Constance was not there. Another calculation, she was the family money, and her presence might have introduced a note of naked financial interest that Gerald wanted to keep submerged beneath the language of fairness and family. Gerald shook Harold's hand. He looked at me and said, "Cease," in the tone people use when they're performing warmth for a witness who isn't there. I said, "Gerald." Marcus sat down without saying anything. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stillness, and he was looking at the manila envelope with the practiced non-expression of someone who has been told not to look too interested. Harold opened the meeting. He explained the structure. He would walk through the will's provisions as they related to the cabin property specifically, then introduce the trust document, then open Exhibit A per its terms, then invite any discussion. He said this pleasantly, procedurally, like a man who had done this many times and was not troubled by it. Gerald's attorney, Polk, said, "Before we get into the trust document, I'd like to address a concern on behalf of my client regarding the beneficiary designation." Harold said, "We'll get to that in the appropriate order." Polk said, "I think it's relevant to establish up front." Harold said, "Darren, they knew each other, it turned out, from the county bar. We'll get to that in the appropriate order." Polk closed his portfolio and smiled and waited. Harold walked through the will. The Traverse City house, the accounts, the personal property, all of it clean, clear, uncontested. My mother wasn't at the meeting because her portion of the estate was straightforward, and she and Gerald had already agreed on the house. What remained was the cabin. Harold said, "The cabin property and the 42 acres at Barrow Lake were transferred, in December of 2019, into the Hartley Family Cabin Trust. I am the trustee. The trust document is recorded with the Antrim County Register of Deeds. The beneficiary designation is determined by Exhibit A of the trust agreement, which I am now, per the terms of the instrument, opening for the first time in the presence of all required parties. He opened the sealed envelope. He placed Exhibit A on the table in front of him. He read the 4 conditions aloud. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Polk said, "This is exactly the kind of vague, subjective beneficiary designation that courts have found problematic. The conditions are unverifiable. There's no neutral party who can assess." Harold said, "Actually, there is. I'm him. I'm the trustee, and the trust document specifically designates me as the verification authority for conditions 1 through 3, with supporting documentation. I have known this family for 32 years. I attended the cabin myself twice, at Ede's invitation. I'm as neutral a party as you're likely to find." Polk said, "The 4th condition is completely subjective. A letter. There's no way to verify authenticity, no." Harold said, "The 4th condition is what it is. Ede wrote it. It was witnessed and notarized. If you'd like to challenge the trust's validity, that's your prerogative, and you're welcome to file in probate court. But I'll tell you now that this instrument was reviewed by a Grand Rapids estate litigation specialist before execution, and I'm confident in its structure." He paused. "Should we continue?" Gerald had not spoken yet. He was watching me. He was watching the manila envelope. Harold said, "I'd like to begin with Condition 1. Presence at the cabin for a minimum of 5 consecutive summers, 1995 to 2020. I opened the manila envelope. I had spent the weekend going through my mother's photo albums, my own digital archives, and a wooden box my grandfather had kept in his study that I had been given after the funeral, a box that contained, among other things, a logbook. A handwritten logbook my grandfather had kept of every visit to the cabin since 1975. Dates, names, notes. Patricia and Cecilia arrived Thursday. Weather clear. Cecilia found a painted turtle in the shallows and carried it to the dock to show me. Released unharmed. The logbook covered 1995 through 2019. My name appeared in it every single summer, every single one. Marcus's name appeared in 11 summers, not consecutively. Tyler's name appeared in 6. I placed the logbook on the table. I placed beside it a set of photographs, dated, showing me at the cabin across multiple decades. The dock, the porch, the kitchen, the tree line. I placed beside those a letter from my mother attesting to our presence, and a letter from Carl, my grandfather's chess partner, who had visited the cabin 4 times and had written a statement that Ede had spoken of Cecilia's summers therewith. And this was Carl's phrasing, not mine. The kind of certainty a man uses when he's talking about something he's already decided. Harold looked at the documentation. He said, "Condition 1 is satisfied." Polk said, "I'd like to note for the record that." Harold said, "Noted." He moved to the next page of his legal pad. Condition 2, knowledge of the cabin's maintenance systems. I placed a second folder on the table. In it was a letter Harold himself had written, because the trust document specified Harold as verification authority, attesting that Ede Hartley had informed him, on 3 separate occasions between 2017 and 2020, that Cecilia Voss Hartley had been taught the well pump protocol, had personally assisted with a septic inspection in 2016, and had performed a roof inspection walkthrough with him in 2018. Harold said, "I wrote this letter in anticipation of this meeting, per the trust's terms. I can speak to it directly if needed." Gerald said, "For the first time he stopped." Harold looked at him. "Gerald." Gerald said, "This is very thorough." Harold said, "Yes, Ede was thorough." Condition 3 was the easiest. I had lived in Traverse City for 4 years. I had a lease. I had a Michigan driver's license. I had filed Michigan state taxes, and I had prepared, per the trust's requirement, a signed statement affirming that I intended to maintain the cabin as a seasonal residence and not convert it to rental or commercial use, accompanied by an acknowledgement of the 5-year deed restriction that would be attached to the title upon transfer. I signed the statement on the table, in front of everyone. Then Harold said, "Condition 4. The room felt different, not tense exactly, quieter, more specific. Harold said, "The qualified heir must present, in original form, a letter from Ede Hartley written on cream-colored stationery, referencing the cabin, received at some point during Ede's lifetime and kept in their possession. I reached into the manila envelope and took out the cream envelope. My grandfather's handwriting, Cecilia. I placed it on the table. Harold picked it up. He looked at the handwriting. He turned it over. He removed the letter and read it, though I think he had seen it before. My grandfather was thorough, and I think Harold and my grandfather had discussed it. He read it the way you read something you already know, checking it against your memory of the original. He placed it back on the table. He said, "This satisfies condition 4. He looked at Gerald. He said, "All 4 conditions are met. Under the terms of the Hartley Family Cabin Trust, the cabin and the 42 acres at Barrow Lake transfer to Cecilia Voss Hartley as the qualified heir." Gerald's attorney spoke for another 20 minutes. I want to be accurate about this. Polk was good at his job, which was to find angles. He argued that the trust conditions were too subjective. He argued that the logbook was self-serving evidence. He argued that the letter could not be authenticated without handwriting analysis. He argued that a trust with this structure had elements that were unusual, which was true but not a legal defect. Harold answered each objection with the specific, prepared patience of a man who had anticipated them and had answers ready. He cited the case law on condition precedent trusts. He noted that the logbook was in Ede's handwriting, not mine. He said that if Gerald wanted handwriting analysis, he was welcome to commission it, and offered to facilitate, and noted that the trust document included a provision allowing the trustee to recover costs from the estate if a challenge was found to be without merit. After 20 minutes, Polk leaned back slightly. Gerald looked at the table. Marcus looked at his phone. Polk said, "My client would like to discuss this with me privately before making any decisions about next steps." Harold said, "Of course." They went into the hallway. Harold and I sat in the conference room. I drank my gas station coffee, which was cold. Harold said, "You're doing well." I said, "Is it over?" He said, "The meeting is over. Whether Gerald files in probate court is his decision. But I want you to understand, and Ede wanted you to understand, that this trust was designed by someone who knew Gerald. He anticipated a challenge. The structure withstands one." He paused. He said, "I've been doing this for 41 years. In my experience, people in Gerald's position sometimes file and sometimes don't. Filing costs money. It takes time. And this particular instrument is, I'm going to use the word Ede used when we finished drafting it." He smiled slightly. He said it was airtight. He said it the way he said everything, like he'd checked it twice and was satisfied. I thought about my grandfather at his kitchen table, moving his bishop. Check. I said, "He was usually right." Harold said yes, he was. Gerald came back into the room 8 minutes later. Polk was behind him. Gerald sat down across from me and looked at me for a moment, not the winning smile from the beginning of the meeting. Something more complicated. Something I recognized, eventually, as the look of a person recalibrating. He said, "I don't want to fight over this, Cease." I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to know that I think Dad loved you very much." I said, "I know he did." He said, I thought the property should have been split. I thought it was fair." I said, "I understand that you thought that." He said, "You're going to keep it, the cabin." I said, "Yes." He looked at the window. He said, "Good. It should stay in the family." I didn't point out the thing that was true, which was that keeping it in the family was exactly what my grandfather had done. I just said, "Yes, it should." Gerald did not file in probate court. I know this because Harold told me, 3 months later, that Polk had advised him not to, that the trust structure was sound enough that a challenge would cost more than it was likely to recover, and that the logbook and the letter and the prepared documentation made the case for my meeting the conditions strong enough that even a sympathetic judge would have difficulty ruling otherwise. What Gerald did do in January was send me a text message. It said, "If you ever want company at the cabin, Marcus and Tyler would like to come sometime. Not to make things complicated, just to see the place." I read that text 3 times. Then I wrote back, They're welcome in August. Bring cereal. I want to tell you about the first morning I woke up at the cabin, knowing it was mine. It was late November still, the week after the estate meeting. I drove up alone, 3 hours north, the last 40 minutes on roads that the GPS didn't entirely trust. I pulled into the gravel drive and sat in the car for a moment looking at the standing seam steel roof, catching the gray November light and the pine trees and the dead garden beds along the south wall that I was going to replant in spring. I went inside. The house was cold. I'd had the heat set low for the off-season. I turned the thermostat up and listened to the furnace kick on, which it did with the same solid, reliable sound it had made my entire life. The well pump was fine. The septic was fine. The roof, which I had inspected with my grandfather 8 years ago and had inspected again by myself the previous spring, was fine. I made coffee. I found, in the cabinet where they had always been, the cereal boxes my grandfather kept stocked from early summer through late fall, 2 kinds, one with more sugar than the other, which was the one he preferred, though he never admitted it. I poured a bowl. I put on my coat and my hat and I went out onto the porch. The lake was fully frozen. The tree line was bare and dark against a white sky. The dock extended out over the ice, wooden and solid, built by my grandfather the same summer he'd built the cabin because he believed a property on water should have a dock and that a dock should be built to last. I sat in the chair that was his. I ate my cereal. I said, out loud to no one and to him, I knew you would. Which is what he'd said to me 30 years ago when I walked out of those woods with the compass, when I found my way back without him. I had found my way back. I have been asked, since this happened, by my mother, by a friend who is an attorney, by my cousin Marcus when we finally talked on the phone in February, what I think my grandfather was really doing, what the document meant, whether it was about the cabin at all. I've thought about that question a lot. Here is what I think. I think my grandfather understood something that most people don't say out loud, which is that inheritance is not really about property. It is about recognition. It is about a person saying, with legal force and deliberate intention, I saw you. I knew who you were. And I trusted you with the thing I cared most about. The cabin conditions were not a puzzle. They weren't a test of cleverness or legal sophistication. They were a description. My grandfather sat down in December of 2019 and wrote a description of a person who loved that place the way he loved it, who had been there, consistently, for years, who understood how it worked, who intended to keep it, who had held his words privately without needing to perform them for anyone else. He wrote that description, and it was me. Not because he was trying to exclude Gerald, not out of spite or score settling. He left Gerald a fair share of everything else. He left him the house and the accounts and the personal property divided equitably. He left me the cabin because the cabin was not about money. It was about love. And love, at its most honest, is specific. It goes to specific people for specific reasons that can be described and documented and defended, if necessary, in a third-floor conference room with gas station coffee and a burgundy folder and a man in an expensive suit who did not, in the end, have anything to say that mattered. My grandfather built the cabin in 1971 with walls 2 inches thicker than code required and a steel roof and a foundation poured 4 feet deep. He built the trust in 2019 with the same logic. If you build it right, you only have to build it once. I am sitting on the porch as I record this. It is August. The lake is still in the early morning and the sky is the particular shade of pale gold that happens for about 20 minutes at this hour before it sharpens into full day. Marcus arrived yesterday with his family, his wife, his 2 kids, his folding chairs, and his cooler. They're inside still, sleeping. Last night we grilled on the lawn and Marcus's youngest, a girl named Opal who is 7, asked me if I'd always loved this place. I said always. She said, how long is always? I said, as long as I can remember. She thought about this. Then she said, is it going to be your cabin forever? I looked at the lake. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about cream-colored stationery and a logbook and a compass in the woods, and a bishop moved across a chessboard and a foundation poured 4 feet deep. I said, yes, It's going to be mine forever." She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her marshmallow. I think about what my grandfather wrote to me in that last letter sometimes, about love and trust, and how the rarer gift is to be trusted. I've thought about what he did, the years of it, the deliberateness of it, the care he took to make sure that what he intended to happen would happen, even after he was gone. Most people don't do that. Most people assume good faith will prevail, that family will be reasonable, that love will be self-evident. My grandfather had too much life experience to assume any of those things. He knew that grief makes people strange, and that money makes people stranger, and that love without documentation is just a feeling that can be argued away in a conference room by someone with a leather portfolio. So he documented. He built it right. And on a Tuesday in October, when my uncle slid a deed across a mahogany table and smiled at me like he'd already won, I sat across from him with a gas station coffee and a manila envelope and a cream-colored letter with my name on it in my grandfather's handwriting, and I thought, he knew. He knew exactly what this day would look like, and he prepared for it, and I am not unprepared. I am not unprepared. If you've been through something like this, if you've sat in a room where someone underestimated you, where someone thought the outcome was already decided, where someone smiled at you from across a table they thought they owned, I want you to know that the people who loved you clearly saw you clearly. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they wrote it down. My grandfather wrote it down. I am the thing he wrote. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Signed and Silent. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the person in the family who was trusted quietly, who was loved without performance, who held something private and kept it, leave a comment below. I read them all. If you'd like to support this channel, a subscription and a thumbs up go further than you'd think. And if there's someone in your life who has loved you the way Ed Hartley loved Cecilia, tell them, while you still can. Until next time.